All right, so 1984. I feel like everybody's heard of this book,
Yeah.
Big Brother, Thought Police, all that.
Yeah.
But, you know, is it actually worth reading today in 2025? There's a lot of books out there.
Right.
So that's what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah.
We've got a recent personal review
Okay.
and a detailed online summary to kind of go through.
Cool.
So what do you think? Verdict first.
Hmm.
Is 1984 a book worth reading today?
I'm going to give you a clear yes.
Okay.
1984 is absolutely worth reading today. It's more than just the classic. It's a chillingly relevant look at how power and information can be used to control society. And I think that's something that we all think about and are concerned about in the current world.
Yeah, no, definitely you've got my attention.
Yeah.
But who would you say this book is really for? Is this like for everyone, or is there a specific type of reader that would get the most out of 1984?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting because 1984 is often categorized as dystopian fiction. But I think it's really going to resonate most with readers that are interested in politics,
Okay.
social dynamics, psychology, even philosophy.
Wow.
Anyone who's ever felt uneasy about the amount of data that's collected online, or the spread of misinformation, or the power of those in control of information is going to find a lot to ponder here. I think it's kind of like holding up a mirror to some of the anxieties that we have in the digital age.
So not exactly a light beach read then?
No, not really.
Okay. All right. Good to know.
Mm.
Now, I have to admit, I've always been a little intimidated by 1984.
Yeah.
It has that reputation of being really dense and difficult, almost like reading a textbook.
I get that.
Yeah.
It's a common misconception, though.
Okay.
While it deals with some complex themes, Orwell's writing is surprisingly accessible. He uses vivid imagery and actually creates a very suspenseful atmosphere that pulls you into the protagonist's world.
Okay.
So you actually find yourself really fearing for Winston, the main character, as he navigates this really oppressive society.
Interesting. So it's not just like all heady concept. It's actually like a story that you get.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. That's reassuring to hear.
Yeah.
I always appreciate an author who can tackle big ideas without, making my brain hurt.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of big ideas, our reviewer mentioned some really impactful quotes from the book.
Yes.
One in particular stood out to me. It was, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. What makes that quote so powerful, and why do you think it resonated so much with our reader?
That quote is chilling, right? I mean, it really cuts to the core of what makes 1984 so unsettling and relevant.
Yeah.
The ruling power in the book, they manipulate history to maintain control.
Right.
They erase inconvenient facts, they rewrite events, and they're constantly shifting the narrative to kind of serve their agenda.
Wow.
So for the reader, it's really about the fragility of truth and how those in power can manipulate our understanding of the world and of history.
It makes you think about what's happening today.
Yeah.
With like fake news and deep fakes and the constant battle over information online.
Exactly. It's like all of that wrapped up into one sentence.
Yeah, it really makes you question everything you read and see online.
It does.
Makes you think about who's controlling the narrative and how is that narrative being shaped.
Yeah, and who benefits from that narrative.
Exactly. And, we're living in a time where dystopian fiction is super popular. The Hunger Games, Divergent, all those, how does 1984 stack up against these more modern takes on the genre?
Yeah, it's interesting. While those books you mentioned definitely tap into some similar anxieties that we have about control and oppression, 1984 stands apart because it really focuses on psychological manipulation.
Okay.
It's not just about physical control or surviving in some kind of harsh environment. It's about the more insidious ways in which totalitarian regimes can actually warp minds and perceptions of reality.
Yep.
Think of it this way. In the Hunger Games, you see the violence, you see the oppression on the surface. In 1984, the real battle is happening inside people's minds.
So it's more about the mind games than it is about the explosions.
Exactly. It's much more of a slow burn that really gets under your skin, and it makes you question the very nature of truth and freedom and individuality. And so this makes it a thought-provoking read in a very different way than those other books.
I can see how that would be a different kind of scary.
It is.
Yeah. All right. But, some people find 1984 pretty bleak and depressing. They worry it'll be too dark or leave them feeling hopeless.
Sure.
What would you say to those who are hesitant to read it for that reason?
Well, I understand that concern. 1984 definitely isn't a lighthearted beach read.
Yeah.
It really confronts us with some pretty heavy stuff. The potential for abuse of power, the fragility of truth, the very real dangers of unchecked authority. But I think that's precisely why it's so important to read.
So you're saying it's more of a wake-up call than a downer?
Exactly. Orwell wasn't trying to depress his readers. He was sounding an alarm, urging us to be vigilant about defending our freedoms, our right to think critically, our access to accurate information.
Right.
The darkness of the book serves as a stark reminder of what we stand to lose if we become complacent.
It's not about accepting that bleak future, but about being aware of the potential dangers so that we can try to avoid them.
Exactly.
Okay, now one of the things that's always intrigued me about 1984 is the concept of Newspeak. This is more than just a cool fictional language, right?
Absolutely. Newspeak is really brilliant, I think, because it illustrates how language can be manipulated to actually control thought. It's a simplified, very controlled language that's designed to limit the range of ideas and expressions that people can even have. So the goal is to literally narrow the scope of human thought itself.
So it's not just about changing the words, it's about changing what people are even able to think.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that we see echoes of this in the way that language is being used online today.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that. Like, what are some specific examples where you see this Newspeak playing out in the digital world?
Well, think about the way that algorithms curate our online experiences. They can create echo chambers where we're only exposed to information that reinforces our existing beliefs.
Right.
So this can lead to a real narrowing of perspectives and a difficulty in actually engaging with differing viewpoints. It's almost like those algorithms are creating a real-life version of Newspeak by limiting the vocabulary of ideas that we're even exposed to.
Wow, that's a really interesting parallel and a little unsettling, to be honest.
Yeah, it is a little creepy.
It is. It makes you realize how easily we can be manipulated without even realizing it. It's like we're being subtly nudged towards certain ways of thinking.
Exactly. And that's why I think 1984 feels so relevant today.
Yeah.
It forces us to be more conscious of the language that we use, the information that we consume, the narratives that are shaping our worldview.
This is making me want to go back and reread 1984 with fresh eyes.
I think you'll find it a completely different experience reading it now with all of the technological advancements and the way that information flows in our society.
So if you could give just one piece of advice to someone who's on the fence about reading 1984, what would it be?
I'd say don't be intimidated by its reputation. Yes, it's a challenging read, but it's also a deeply rewarding one.
Okay.
1984 will make you think. It'll make you question and perhaps even see the world around you in a new light. And in a world where we're bombarded with information and manipulated in subtle ways, that kind of critical thinking is more valuable than ever.
Okay, I like that. You've definitely convinced me to bump 1984 up my reading list.
Awesome.
Now, our reviewer mentioned that they were drawn to 1984 because they'd seen it on a friend's reading list and remembered maybe encountering it in high school. It sounds like this is a book that stays with you, even if you only had a brief encounter with it years ago. What do you think it is about 1984 that makes it so memorable?
I think there's something about the imagery and the concepts in 1984 that embeds itself in your mind.
Yeah.
Big Brother.
Right.
The thought police.
Yeah.
The ever-present surveillance. These have become cultural touchstones that we use to describe real-world situations all the time.
It's true. You hear those phrases even if people haven't actually read the book.
Exactly.
They've kind of seeped into our collective consciousness.
Right. They're part of the lexicon now.
But I think there's more to it than just catchy phrases.
Yeah.
The book seems to tap into some primal fear about being controlled, about losing our individuality.
It does. It speaks to a very deep-seated anxiety about the potential for power to be abused and for technology to be used to control and manipulate us.
And those fears are perhaps even more relevant today than they were when Orwell wrote the book.
Absolutely.
Given the advances in surveillance technology and the pervasiveness of social media.
In many ways, Orwell was incredibly prescient in his vision of a future where technology is used to monitor and control citizens. We see echoes of 1984 in the rise of facial recognition software,
Right.
the tracking of our online activity, the use of algorithms to shape our perceptions.
It's almost like we're living in a milder, more subtle version of 1984 sometimes.
Perhaps. But the good news is that by becoming aware of these tactics, we can start to resist them.
Okay.
We can question the narratives we're being fed. We can challenge the language that is being used to manipulate us. We can demand more honesty and transparency in our public discourse.
I love that. It's like 1984 is both a warning and a call to action.
Precisely. It's a reminder that we can't take our freedoms for granted. We have to be active participants in shaping our own realities and defending the values that we hold dear.
I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but we were running out of time. So for our listeners who are now seriously considering picking up 1984, what's your final recommendation? Is this a book for everyone?
I'd say 1984 is essential reading for anyone who is interested in understanding the dynamics of power and control and the human condition. It's particularly relevant, I think, for those who are concerned about the erosion of privacy, the spread of misinformation, and the rise of authoritarian tendencies in the world. It's a book that will challenge you, it will provoke you, and it will stay with you long after you turn that final page.
So if you're ready to have your mind blown and your worldview shaken up a bit, 1984 is waiting for you.
It is, but it's not a passive experience.
Okay.
This is a book that demands your attention, demands your critical thinking, and your willingness to engage with some difficult questions.
Feels like a reading experience that stays with you long after you turn that final page.
It certainly does for me, and I suspect it will for you too.
Okay, I'm sold. I'm adding 1984 to my reading list as we speak.
I think you'll find it well worth your time.
Now, for our listeners who are still on the fence, I'd like to leave you with this thought. Think about the ways in which language is used to shape your perceptions, to influence your decisions, even to control your behavior. Are there any Newspeak examples in your own life?
It's happening all around us, whether we're aware of it or not.
Right.
And the more we understand these subtle forms of manipulation, the better equipped we'll be to resist them.
That's a great point to end on. It's like 1984 is a lens through which we can examine our own world and become more aware of the forces that are shaping it.
And hopefully that awareness will empower us to be more critical thinkers, more engaged citizens, and more vocal defenders of the freedoms that we hold dear.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. This has been a fascinating deep dive into 1984, a book that continues to resonate and challenge us decades after its publication.
It's a book that I find myself returning to again and again, always discovering new layers of meaning and relevance.
And for our listeners who are now ready to embark on their own journey into Orwell's dystopian world, I'd say buckle up. It's going to be a thought-provoking ride.
But one that will ultimately make you a more informed, a more engaged, and perhaps even a more hopeful citizen of the world.
And isn't that what it's all about? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of ideas that matter.
Yeah, it really is. And it can be uncomfortable at times, you know?
Oh, yeah.
But ultimately, I think it's a hopeful one. It reminds us that we have the power to resist, to question, and to shape our own future.
Right. Like we're not powerless.
Exactly.
Now I'm curious about something our reviewer mentioned. They said reading 1984 made them hyper-aware of how language is used in their own workplace.
Interesting.
Like, have you ever noticed that kind of newspeak creeping into everyday life?
Oh, absolutely. All the time. Think about corporate jargon, for example. How many times have you heard phrases like synergy
Oh, yeah.
or paradigm shift or thinking outside the box? Often these terms are used to obfuscate rather than clarify, to create a sense of exclusivity or even to mask some unpleasant realities.
It's like they're trying to control the conversation by using language that feels deliberately vague and inaccessible to outsiders.
It is. It's a very subtle form of power dynamics.
Yeah.
And it's not just limited to the corporate world either. You see it in politics and advertising, even in our personal relationships. Think about the way that certain words are used to demonize opponents or to create fear or to sell us products.
Right. It's almost like a form of mind control, isn't it? Like they're trying to implant certain ideas or beliefs in our subconscious without us even realizing it.
It's certainly a way of influencing our perceptions and shaping our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
And it's something that Orwell was very keenly aware of. That's why Newspeak is such a powerful tool in the novel. It represents the ultimate form of linguistic manipulation.
You know, one thing I found particularly disturbing in 1984 was the idea of doublethink.
Oh, yes.
Can you explain what that is and why it's so insidious?
Sure. Doublethink is the ability to hold two completely contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accept both of them as true. It's like mental gymnastics that the party uses to control its citizens.
Yeah.
So, for example, they might claim that war is peace or that freedom is slavery. It's a way of shutting down critical thinking and creating a state of constant cognitive dissonance.
That's just messed up.
It is.
It's like gaslighting, but on a societal level.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder if we're not seeing elements of doublethink in our own culture today.
You know, I think there are definitely some parallels there. Think about the way that we're constantly bombarded with conflicting information from different sources.
Yeah, it's hard to know what to believe.
It really is. It can be very difficult to discern what's true and what's not. And sometimes we might even find ourselves accepting these contradictory narratives just to avoid the mental discomfort of actually grappling with those complex issues.
Right. So instead of actually like engaging in critical thinking and trying to reconcile those conflicting viewpoints, We just kind of shut down and accept whatever feels easiest
Right.
or most comfortable in the moment.
It's a very natural human tendency to avoid cognitive dissonance.
Right.
But as Orwell shows us in 1984, it can also be a very dangerous trap. It can lead to apathy, complacency, and ultimately a loss of individual autonomy.
This is making me rethink my whole approach to consuming information. I need to be more critical, more discerning.
Yes.
But it's hard when we're just constantly being bombarded with stuff from all sides.
It is a challenge. But that's why it's so important to cultivate those critical thinking skills. Don't just accept information at face value.
Okay.
Question the source, consider the motives, look for evidence, and be willing to engage with those differing viewpoints.
It's like 1984 is a training manual for navigating the complexities of the information age.
I like that analogy. It's a tool that can help us to become more discerning consumers of information, more aware of the forces that are trying to shape our thinking, and ultimately more empowered citizens.
I think that's a great point to end on. If you're intrigued by the ideas that we've discussed, I highly recommend checking out 1984 for yourself.
It's a good one.
It's a challenging but ultimately rewarding read that will stay with you long after you turn the final page.
And I'd add that it's a book that can be revisited multiple times throughout your life. You'll likely find new insights and connections with each reading as your own experiences and your understanding of the world evolve.
I've definitely found that with other classic novels that I've gone back to and reread.
It's amazing how they change.
Yeah, they take on new meaning as you grow and experience more of the world. Now, before we wrap up, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought. What examples of newspeak or information control can you identify in your own life? How is language being used to shape your perceptions, influence your decisions, and even control your behavior?
That's a big question.
It is.
And it's one that's worth pondering. It's all around us once we start paying attention. But the first step to resisting manipulation is recognizing that it's happening. So be curious, be critical, and be vigilant in defending your right to think for yourself.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into 1984. We'll be back next time with another exploration of ideas that matter. Until then, stay curious and keep questioning everything. It's funny because as we're talking about this, I'm realizing how much I use those vague corporate buzzwords myself.
Right.
Without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's like it's so easy to just fall into these patterns of language without even realizing the implications.
It's true. We all do it to some extent. It's like language is a constantly evolving organism, and sometimes those subtle shifts can be hard to detect. But the more aware we are of how language is being used to shape our thoughts and actions, the better equipped we'll be to resist those influences.
Yeah, it's like having a mental shield.
Exactly.
Against manipulation. Now, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on one more aspect of 1984 that really stuck with me and frankly kind of freaked me out.
Okay.
The idea of thought crime. The party could punish you just for thinking the wrong things.
Right.
Do you think that's something we should be concerned about in our own time, even if it's not as blatant as in the book?
That's a fascinating question, and it's definitely something that resonates today, especially with the increasing scrutiny of online activity and the debates around free speech and censorship. While we might not have literal thought police bursting into our homes for having dissenting opinions,
Right.
there are definitely pressures to conform to certain ideologies and a growing intolerance for views that fall outside the mainstream.
So you're saying there are more subtle ways of enforcing conformity,
Absolutely.
even in supposedly free societies?
Exactly. Think about the concept of cancel culture, for example.
Right. Yeah.
While the intention might be to hold individuals accountable for harmful actions or words, it can also create a climate of fear where people are hesitant to express unpopular opinions or challenge those dominant narratives.
Right.
And so it creates this pressure to self-censor, which is a form of thought control, even if it's not enforced by a government entity.
Wow, that's a really thought-provoking connection.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how the lines between freedom of thought and social pressure can get kind of blurred.
Yeah, they're not always so clear-cut.
Yeah. It's like we're constantly navigating this minefield of what's acceptable to think and say,
Right.
even if it's not explicitly stated.
Exactly. And that's why 1984 is such a powerful cautionary tale. It reminds us that the battle for freedom of thought is an ongoing one, and we can't afford to take it for granted. We have to be willing to speak up, challenge those who seek to limit our thinking, and defend the right to express those diverse perspectives, even when they're uncomfortable or unpopular.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
You've given me so much to think about.
Glad to hear it.
And honestly, I'm feeling a little fired up to reread 1984 and see it with these new insights in mind.
I encourage you to. It's a book that can be reread and reinterpreted throughout your life, and I think you'll find that it speaks to you differently each time, depending on your own experiences and the current state of the world.
Well, for our listener who's been with us on this journey, what's your final takeaway? Why should they read 1984 now in 2025?
1984 is a vital read for anyone who cares about the future of freedom, truth, and individuality. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of critical thinking, and the need to be vigilant in defending our right to think for ourselves. And in a world where technology is rapidly changing the way we live, think, and interact, those themes are more relevant than ever before.
So it's not just about avoiding some dystopian future. It's about understanding the forces that are shaping our world today and being active participants in shaping the future we want to see.
Exactly. 1984 is a call to action, a reminder that we have the power to choose awareness over ignorance, courage over complacency, and freedom over control.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Listener, we hope you found this exploration of 1984 enlightening and empowering. Remember, the fight for freedom of thought starts with each of us. Stay curious, stay critical, and keep questioning everything. Until next time, keep diving deep.